Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of seconds here as we have people joining us, and then we will jump in and get started. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Americans for a Clean Energy Grid's latest transmission time webinar. My name is Gretchen Kershaw. I am the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Strategy at Grid Strategies, and I will be your host and moderator today as we discuss keeping the lights on, strengthening America's grid against extreme weather. Just to give a brief intro of the topic, we are seeing increasingly frequent and extreme weather events across the United States. These are putting the vulnerability of our nation's aging electric grid on full display time and time again. Recent heat waves in the East have pushed electricity demand and prices to peak levels, and blackouts in Louisiana have highlighted the very real consequences of an electric system that is not up to the task. Interregional transmission, the big power lines help us move power between regions of the country, remains one of the most effective yet underutilized tools to enhance reliability, lower cost, and improve the resilience of our system during extreme events. So our panelists today are going to explore how building a stronger, more connected grid can protect communities, stabilize energy markets, and ensure reliable power is available when and where it is needed most. As some like to say, we are going to talk about how to build a grid that is bigger than the weather. And I am happy to be joined today with a stellar lineup of panelists, which I'm going to briefly introduce, and then we will jump into the questions. So first we have Commissioner Devontae Lewis, who was elected in 2022 to serve as Public Service Commissioner for Louisiana's 3rd District, representing constituents in 10 Louisiana parishes, including Baton Rouge and New Orleans greater metropolitan areas. He previously worked at the Louisiana Budget Project as Director of Public Affairs and Outreach, where he focused on higher education policy, consumer protection policies, monitoring legislative developments, and working with advocacy groups and coalition partners to forge a common agenda and an action plan for advancing policies that benefit Louisianans with low and moderate incomes. Next, we are joined by Andy Kowalczyk, Director of Transmission for the Southern Renewable Energy Association since 2022. He has advocated for clean energy policy at the local, state, regional, and federal level, supporting renewable energy for distribution level and utility scale resources throughout the Gulf Coast since 2016. Previous to SRIA, he has been a consultant to 350 New Orleans, the Energy Foundation, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, focusing on transmission planning and interconnection of renewable energy resources. And last but not least, we have John Burdicker, Director of the Transmission Center of Excellence for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. John is focused on advancing regional and interregional transmission and the integration of new energy resources. Previously, he held leadership roles in transmission planning and resource integration for ERCOT in Texas. So I have a list of questions. I've never been known to run out of questions, especially when we're talking about transmission, but I do want to encourage the audience members to use the Q&A function to submit questions as well. I will aim to monitor that and sprinkle your questions in with the ones that I have on my list. So to kick things off, I want to do a round robin, give the panelists all a chance to jump in here. As I mentioned in the intro, in recent months, we have seen our nation's grid put to the test over and over. What do you see as the biggest threat to grid reliability today, and what role does transmission, especially interregional transmission, play in addressing that threat? And let's see, I will start at the top of my screen with Andy.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me here, first of all, and thanks for this question, because as you mentioned, we have been experiencing some major reliability events, not only within the last 5 years or so in South Louisiana and throughout the Southeast, with Winter Storms Elliott and Winter Storm Uri, impacting, the SIRTEP region with Winter Storm Elliott and then, Winter Storm Uri, in MISO South, But we also had this May 25th load shed event that resulted in 600 megawatts of load being shed. And, as we are progressing into a world where we see a lot more frequent extreme weather events, extreme cold and extreme heat, in addition to, these more probabilistic sort of issues like hurricanes, where you don't know where it's going to hit, and it's very hard to predict those sorts of things. We need to be looking at the transfer capability question and being able to access generation where it's generating and connecting it to load when it's needed. And what happened on May 25th was kind of a lesson in you can have a lot of generation, but when you have forced outages and when you have planned outages that are creeping into seasons where it's starting to get hotter, you're starting to see bigger problems and you're starting to see shortfalls. And if you don't have really good connectivity on a regional basis, you're not going to be able to maintain resource adequacy and reliability and ride out a hotter than normal May day on a holiday weekend as well. So, I mean, I see the management of fleets as a liability. I also see lack of regional connectivity as a liability and a challenge. And I see cost as a barrier too. You need to be considering what the benefits of large transmission solutions are, not only the reliability side of it, but also the economic side of things too, so that you're able to manage costs as you're meeting these reliability needs through building out transmission and generation too. So that's my piece on that.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I'll move down the screen. I've got John right in the middle.
Yeah, thanks, Gretchen. And echoing Andy's thanks for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Just adding a bit on to what Andy said. I think we're all aware we're seeing demand growth that we have not seen for a few decades, at least in most regions right now. At the same time as we're seeing a lot of aging infrastructure and aging resources coming off the system or experiencing more frequent forced outages. I think it's been pretty well identified that one of the biggest reliability concerns at the moment is really surrounding resource adequacy. And obviously, we need resources to meet that need. But we also need transmission to be able to efficiently utilize those resources, and particularly interregional transmission that allows us to effectively share resources across regions and take advantage of both resource and geographic diversity, but also to provide the resiliency benefits. And that includes having resource adequacy benefit in and of itself, which I'm sure we'll dig into a little bit more later. And I think, Gretchen, you hit on this in your intro. It's really, there's a ton of value in that resource adequacy and broader resiliency picture from having transmission that's bigger than the size of a storm front.
Thanks, John. And I will move now to you, Commissioner Lewis.
Thank you, and I will echo the invitation to join this webinar this afternoon, and what John and Andy has said, I think, are the questions that I really have to tackle with as a regulator thinking about this. I mean, reliability, particularly where I'm from in South Louisiana, where I represent the area of Baton Rouge, New Orleans. Some would call it industrial corridor. Other people call it Cancer Alley. We are significantly constrained. We also live in one of the load pockets that exist in this country. The Amite load pocket where there's not enough resources to provide. And as the capacity growth and demand growth, especially from industry, is coming, reliability becomes the biggest topic. But the problem sometimes with reliability, especially when you're talking about this, is we have to also think about affordability from a regulator standpoint. So how do we tackle aging infrastructure, demand growth, requiring resource adequacy, but then also thinking about ratepayers? And so this is the challenge. I think the biggest facing thing that we're facing with reliability right now is how do we modernize? How do we upgrade, but in the most cost-effective way? Because we are probably getting to a point where consumers are either losing the ability to pay or they're losing the willingness to pay. And I think we are going to have to tackle this in a holistic point, which is why I think transmission comes into play. I mean, what we are seeing significantly with demand growth right now is, well, let's build more generators. But we know a combined cycle gas turbine is you probably can't get for 3 to 5 years. So what do you do when the resource that you are used to utilizing has such a long time before it can come online, but you need resources now. And I think this is where transmission really comes into play as we think about where we're going in the future.
Great. Thank you all for setting the stage there. I'm going to stick with you, Commissioner Lewis, because Louisiana has been in the news lately, national news, experiencing blackouts. Tell us what happened there and how do we avoid that happening in the future? And is there a role for interregional transmission in sort of meeting that moment?
Absolutely. So in early May, we had a load shed from SPP in the northwest corner of the state. And then 2 weeks later, we had another load shed from SPP in the northwest corner of the state. Took out about maybe 3,000 to 5,000 customers. You fast forward to the Sunday before Memorial Day, and Louisiana has a load shed of 600 megawatts in the southeast region of the state, right outside of in New Orleans and not. And so we had around 60,000 customers out in New Orleans in the heat of a Sunday afternoon. With anybody knows Louisiana, we love festivals, and so this has been a unique situation for Louisiana to have 3 load sheds in 2 different RTOs within 2 months of each other. And so this has brought the significant question of what do we do and what does reliability really look like, right? And I think this is where interregional transmission comes into play in planning. When we look at that load shed event in MISO's territory and footprint in the MEET load pocket, there were negative price indexes in Mississippi, which from Louisiana to Mississippi is around from New Orleans, I should say, is around a 30-45 minute drive if you contextualize the distance. But we didn't have the opportunity because without significant transmission planning and having interregional transmission, there was nothing we could do. And so I think this is where this conversation now has to go, is we are now seeing this, and the question that my constituents are asking every day is, what does this mean? What does this mean as it gets hotter, as we enter hurricane season, or the meat of hurricane season, I should say, down here in the South? How are we looking at this? And one of the responses that we've kind of seen from our utilities has been a conversation around generators. And I'm saying, well, what are we talking about transmission? How can we utilize that? We had a transmission line that was down during this load shed, and that showcased what the possibilities, but also the harms of not having adequate transmission because there was no back channel flows. We couldn't upflow some of that excess power that we had in other pockets of the state of Louisiana. And so this is what I have been screaming. We saw that the MISO load shed was an IRL transmission issue. And we have recognized that we've been talking about this load pocket outside of New Orleans since 1980. And so when we are putting the facts together, it says, what have we not done since 1980? Well, what we haven't done is we haven't talked significantly about transmission. In Louisiana, we have our integrated resource planning process where, quite frankly, I've voted against every utilities IRP because the one thing they did not talk about was transmission planning. And so I think this is where the conversation has to go. And this is what I'm making the focus that if we're going to talk about reliability, especially in the state of Louisiana after these 2 load shed events, we can do the after action reports. We can talk about which generators were on, offline. But one of the things that we know that had we done it and built more transmission and been interregionally connected, we could have prevented and stopped those load sheds. And so while we handle what happened in the aftermath, I think we have to look for what are the solutions we should be doing, and it's interregional transmission in my view.
Thanks, Commissioner Lewis. That's very insightful. It is pretty shocking to imagine that many blackouts or load shed events occurring in such a short time in just one state. Andy, sort of sticking with the Southeast for a minute, feel free to comment, respond on any of what Commissioner Lewis said, and that sort of talking about what happened in Louisiana, but also just moving beyond that as well. Just we talked in the intro about a lot of population growth in the Southeast, a lot of demand growth from data centers and manufacturing. You talked a little bit about how that's impacting the Southeast power system and what can be done sort of to meet that need also reliably and affordably.
Yeah, it's been a dramatic impact. We're seeing billions in transmission investments in Louisiana as well as Georgia. And some of this is responding to spot load additions. Some of it is responding to resilience needs. Devontae had mentioned, or Commissioner Lewis had mentioned the load pockets, which have been in existence for a very long time in MISO South and South Louisiana. And it's been a liability for both Southeast Texas as well as South Louisiana for a while. But we're starting to see solutions that, frankly, we had been advocating for the last 5 to 7 years, and especially after Winter Storm Uri and Hurricane Laura that created a load pocket in Southeast Texas. And then there was, of course, Hurricane Ida. So it's good to see those, but we're not seeing any benefits calculations. And that is a crucial part of MISO's multi-value planning effort. And we're not seeing the regional transmission that we really need to create connectivity within the MISO South states, which if you're going to do interregional planning, and this is not to knock the need for interregional planning, if you're going to do interregional planning without dealing with the regional topology, you're not going to be able to get the benefits. So it's kind of like you're kind of missing the point if you don't do the regional planning as well as the interregional planning. In the case of Louisiana and Southeast Texas. But we're also seeing, like in the CERTEP system, there's tons of 500 kV being planned in Georgia in response to IRA benefits that they've taken advantage of for manufacturing and data center growth. We've seen like ranges of 16 gigawatts of load growth due to spot load additions to somewhere around like 50 gigawatts in Georgia. And not all of that is going to be fed into the regional plan. It's kind of like the nearer term time horizons and the inked deals that really make it into that planning process. But we're not seeing any regional solutions. We're seeing things that are within Georgia Power Company's territory to respond to generation diversity, like a lot of solar coming online, and this change in massive spot load additions that's happening as well. So we're not really looking at, first of all, benefits, economic benefits, as well as reliability benefits of these large 500 kV solutions. And we're not looking at regional solutions that could be leveraging power from across a wider geography. And that's really where interregional comes in. It doesn't matter. I mean, you could use the terms regional and interregional, but you're talking about administrative borders. You're talking about that with balancing authorities within MISO as well as between regional footprints. And they exist for good reasons, because it's more manageable on a smaller scale. And it's helpful in planning and planning for reserve margins. But the geography should really be driving some of this, the load diversity, the generation diversity, and then, creating venues to talk about what the mutual benefits are. And see a little bit of that happening between MISO South and SPP right now with the coordinated system plan. They just had, I think, their 4th meeting this morning where they're starting to talk about exports and imports between Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. So they're starting to look at those economic benefits and the congestion that they're seeing without transmission, looking out 10 years into the future. They had a waiver request denied at FERC because they just didn't look far enough out into the future. So they're going to have to develop a 15-year out model. But it seems to be received pretty well by stakeholders right now as far as the process. So the looming thing around all of this is cost allocation, and that is a really big challenge. There are approved cost allocation methodologies for both SPP and MISO that are approved at FERC, but it's just a matter of getting consensus on whether those are appropriate for MISO South 2. So we'll really reach that conversation next year with the coordinated system plan. But I guess the role of interregional transmission right now in meeting these big demands and spot load additions and population growth, electrification, generation diversity, all those things, in addition to extreme weather, is that it's kind of a bit part right now, but it is a really important part. We rely heavily on interregional transmission ties right now. And there really isn't that kind of coordination that I mentioned earlier between CERTEP and neighbors. We really have to kind of force the issue. They have they provide the opportunity to propose 5 different studies from stakeholders looking at BA to BA transfers. Some of these can be interregional or they could be within the CERTEP footprint. And we proposed big energy transfers in the past year just to kind of see how it tests the system and what kind of upgrades are needed and how much it costs. Again, what's missing is they're not looking at the benefits, but we've gotten to see some pretty interesting results. Last year, we proposed 10,000 megawatts from MISO North into the SoCo Balancing Authority. And we really saw a lot of constraints throughout the Carolinas in particular. So that's showing that, I mean, not necessarily we need to do the benefits calculation. We need to understand what all the constraints are. And doing it appropriately, you'd want to coordinate with PJM and other balancing authorities to see if that would even be available when you need it. But we are able to, at least through that process, see what the costs are, what the challenges are, how it breaks the system. And sometimes we propose transfers of like 2,500 megawatts and we see that it's like $0. It's just like flow gate reconfiguration or something like that. And those are valuable inputs too, because you just start to see the dynamics of the system. So currently interregional transmission is your designated hitter that hits 500 every time. When it comes up and when you have the extreme weather events, but right now we're not really looking at those economic benefits and those reliability events that are further into the future with scenario-based planning. So,
thanks, Andy. I love the analogies. There's so many analogies, but like, let's keep them coming as we continue to describe how important and valuable interregional transmission is and what it can do. All the different sports analogies. We got bigger than the weather. We got many different things here. I think they're super helpful in trying to break down some of these super wonky topics. So we talked a lot about the Southeast. Let's move up I-95 to the Northeast, to John's neck of the woods, current neck of the woods. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of demand growth also in the Northeast, seeing a lot of extreme weather events. We're seeing extreme events that are different than what historically the system has had to deal with in that region. So I'm interested in how New York is currently leveraging interregional ties with neighbors, as well as what New York may be doing with the rest of the Northeast to ensure stronger interregional ties as you see demand growth and changes in the sort of extreme events stressing the system.
Yeah, thanks. So here in the Northeast, the 3 Northeastern ISOs do coordinate to provide reliability support across the existing ties. So between PJM and the NISO and between the NISO and ISO New England. But there are still a lot of technical and regulatory barriers to further build out of interregional transmission and inefficiencies that need to be addressed. And so New York and our neighboring states are working to address those barriers through the Northeast States Collaborative on interregional transmission. And to that end, the collaborative released a strategic action plan at the end of April, identifying near-term and mid-term actions that the states and others could take to address those barriers. And some of these barriers are going to sound familiar from what Andy was just talking about, if we think about issues of benefits evaluation and cost allocation. But I think one of the biggest ones is really lack of process. So while the Northeastern ISOs do have coordination protocols as required under FERC Order 1000 and are working on the ones required under FERC Order 1920, those planning coordination protocols are not the same as a robust interregional transmission planning process. And so in an effort to tackle some of those barriers and inefficiencies, one of the things identified in the collaborative strategic action plan that we're actually currently undertaking is to look for beneficial concepts for additional interregional transmission that we can then use as potential test cases to address some of those barriers. And so the way we're approaching that is through an RFI that went out at the end of June with responses due on October 23rd, really looking for interregional transmission concepts that would reduce costs for consumers, improve reliability and resiliency, and support economic development. For anyone interested in learning more about that RFI, there's actually going to be a webinar hosted by the collaborative, really a kind of respondents webinar tomorrow from 10 to 11:30 Eastern time. And I'll make sure a link gets dropped in the chat at some point for anybody interested in registering for that. But also focusing on some of the other things and other actions that we're looking at is we see HVDC as a big part, not the entirety, but a big part of the solutions going forward, both at the regional and interregional level, for a number of reasons. But a big challenge there is really a lack of standardization in the U.S. context. So one of the other things identified in the strategic action plan is to take a look at developing HVDC design standards in collaboration with industry groups and consortia that have been funded by the Department of Energy. We're also thinking about some ways that those existing interregional coordination principles could be bolstered. We have an opportunity now, while the ISOs are working on their FERC Order 1920 compliance filings, to really address some of the remaining challenges there, and also looking at, to Andy's points, like benefits evaluation, not just doing it, but making sure it's consistent across the regions, that there's consistency in the timing of those planning processes and the way that benefit metrics are looked at and quantified. And one big example of that is, acknowledging the resource adequacy value that interregional transmission can provide in those benefits evaluation. And then that itself gets to the population that Andy also referenced, because in my mind, in order to have a meaningful cost allocation discussion, you need to be able to show people what those benefits are. It's not cost allocation, it's benefits allocation is really the exercise that you're undertaking. And you need to show each stakeholder in each region how they're benefiting from these projects, which are in numerous ways, in order to get the support necessary to meet the cost allocation challenge. And to what Commissioner Lewis was referencing earlier, identifying what's most cost effective, because it may look low cost to avoid the transmission investment, but that's not the same thing as being most cost effective in the long run. And so we really need to be able to have that robust benefits evaluation and show that quantification to drive forward those discussions.
Thanks, John. And I have to ask, and it came from the audience, but I'm happy to ask it as well. You mentioned DOE funding. I know the Northeast States Collaborative has had DOE funding. Do you expect any changes on with the federal funding landscape as it is that would impact sort of the collaborative and its ongoing work?
No, and I will say the collaborative itself is not DOE funded. There are some opportunities and funding opportunities that were put out by DOE that the collaborative is working with the awardees of those on, and we currently have no expectation of those projects being impacted. And in the collaborative itself, we are not funded by any single state. We're not funded by the federal government. The collaborative looks for multiple funding sources in order to pursue its work. So even if some of those funding sources were to prove less available than originally expected, we foresee having other avenues to approach the critical work we have before us.
Sounds like the collaborative is multi-value planned, which is very wise way to plan your work. So let's see, resource adequacy, very hot topic these days, gets a lot of attention at the federal and state levels. We've talked about it a little bit here today. ACEG released a report on the resource adequacy value of interregional transmission, talking about how that is often undervalued in resource adequacy metrics. You know, we talked a little bit, I think maybe Annie brought up, or others, that, you know, generation is sitting idle. I think Commissioner Lewis was talking about in Mississippi, right? Generation is sitting idle in one area while demand is soaring in another area. The systems are peaking at the same time. So how does interregional transmission fit into the resource adequacy puzzle? We brought up HVDC and have a question from the audience about HVDC. Does it increase transfer capacity just from one region to another, or is it both ways? So maybe we can talk a little bit about that in this context as well. So let's see, Commissioner Lewis, why don't I start with you? Thoughts on sort of resource adequacy and the role of transmission, and any comments on HVDC as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so here in Louisiana, we recently issued a general order about a year ago on our minimum capacity obligations, which require our utilities to have 90% physical capacity for a 4-year forward. And so this has been a topic that we've talked about. And so as you are thinking about now, how do you meet, and we have utilities asking these questions, well, what do we do to meet our now minimum capacity obligations? And one of the things that I think opens the door is transmission. It is building more and having us better interconnected, especially in the region, for merchant power producers, for PPAs, and opens us up to be able to then provide that physical capacity, right? I mean, I think that's going to be something, and this was what I was worried about originally when we created this general order, was, are we de-incentivizing our utilities from demand flexibility, from transmission, because we are saying, oh, okay, wait a minute, like, we're basically encouraging you to use our order to say, well, go build more generation. And so I think that the question makes transmission planning and transmission even more to the forefront in my eyes, because that's how we're going to talk about this, right? I mean, especially with what we're seeing in the federal landscape of what type of generation is being incentivized, and also just from the supply chain, tariffs, et cetera. Kind of going back to what John's saying, I think there's a difference, and I value the difference between cost benefits and then just low cost analysis. And so I think this is where, as we start to, and as you're starting to see a lot of states take resource adequacy as a main target because of the demand growth that we're seeing, and ensuring reliability, it's important. I mean, I think this is why I say transmission it needs to be really led at the commission level, because, I mean, if we're real, the consumers are not sitting there clamoring about transmission lines. I mean, quite frankly, they're not even clamoring about generation. They just want to ensure when that light switch, when they turn it, things come on and they stay on. And so as we are making rules to say, how do we ensure we have the capacity capacity can't just be in buildup, right? Capacity shows up in multiple different ways. And this is where I think transmission plays a role, is that we have to make the case that this is also additional capacity. We are opening, transmission costs are not just a one size kind of idea that we think about, that this is capacity growth. This is allowing for flexible load and price changing, right? If I would be able, and we had stronger transmission here in Louisiana to pull some of the wind that we are seeing in the Midwest and the Plain states, that's a different price index, right? I mean, that changes kind of our resource adequacy. That changes what I have available, especially here in the summer months and in the peak months, right? Where we are now seeing that we are actually hitting our all-time summer peaks a lot higher and a lot faster than predicted. And so that's going to put us saying, wait, do we have the resources needed? And I think if we're talking holistically about reliability, affordability, and sustainability, then transmission is literally the key to unlocking the door of all three of those avenues.
Andy or John, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to respond to Devontae and say preach, because that was all wonderful, especially about leveraging resources from outside of impacted areas in a lot of cases. I mean, we see wind get up to 80% of the generation mix in SPP. That's not always coincident with risk times, but we've seen specifically with HVDC analysis and with Grid United's North Plains connector, that if you're going to do a accreditation type analysis like MISO's risk hour accreditation framework, direct loss of load accreditation, that about 83% of the risk hours in MISO could be covered by excess generation that's available in the West Connect area over there. These things are hard to ignore, and it's part of the reason why, at the behest of some of our members that are developing HVDC projects, that we brought to MISO an issue submission to really evaluate what the value of HVDC transmission is. HVDC could be a capacity resource, but we're just not looking at it like that. I mean, it essentially is a base load generation type resource if it's connected to things that have surplus generation on the other side of it. Modeling what those expectations are of availability, I think, is really crucial in this, but it's going to become increasingly important as we have 3 merchant HVDC projects that are looking to come into operation in the next 5 to 7 years in the MISO footprint. And they're going to be able to tap some really high value wind resources. HVDC can also be bidirectional, so you can get the benefit of resources on both sides. It's all in, how it's being studied in the interconnection process, and MISO is moving forward with some rules around figuring out some of the very unique snowflake kind of elements of HVDC, because as I've heard over and over from developers, that each HVDC project is rather bespoke in how they configure their terminals. So as John had mentioned, it's really important to standardize these things as much as possible so that you can really build what the expectations are about how these resources are going to perform. But this is an issue in front of MISO that we provided a proposal on doing HVDC intertie accreditation to determine the performance of these resources, and then integrate it into this accreditation process that MISO does to determine what resources can be a part of the capacity auction. So I think it's really crucial to try and understand where it fits in so that people aren't over planning or under planning. Just understanding where HVDC fits into the resource adequacy puzzle.
Thanks, Andy. John, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think Commissioner Lewis and Andy have covered most of the bases, but I'll just echo, a couple of things from what they've said and some of my earlier comments that we really need to move forward the recognition and appropriate evaluation of the resource adequacy value of transmission across regions. And Christina, you mentioned the recent report from Americans for Clean Energy Grid and Grid Strategies. There have also been reports from the Energy Systems Integration Group on the multiple values of transmission and on evaluating resiliency benefits of transmission that are hitting on these similar themes. But fundamentally, we need across regions for there to be a recognition of that value, both on the AC and the HVDC side. And as Andy noted, the HVDC side is even more valuable potentially in certain situations from a resource adequacy perspective because you effectively have dispatchable transmission. So if there's available resource on the other side, you have a lot of control for that support. And the question raised was about bidirectionality. It can certainly be designed and built to be supportive in both directions. It's not this injection from area A to area B only and resource adequacy benefits only for some consumers. It really provides the opportunity for it to work in both regions' benefits in both directions and supporting all of those consumers. But without that consistent consideration, without the explicit evaluation of those benefit metrics and cost benefit evaluation, it just makes it more challenging to advance those beneficial projects.
Thanks, John. Yeah, HVDC is a very exciting and useful technology. On the sort of reports, Niskanen Center just put out a report on HVDC transmission and values there. That was just a very interesting op-ed from a former PJM CEO about HVDC transmission and what are its sort of use cases. So certainly encourage those who want to learn more to seek it out because there's a lot of really great material out there and work being done on that. Okay, so Commissioner Lewis, this is something I think that a lot of people probably would love to hear your insights on. You've been an advocate for grid reform. How can we, as transmission advocates, work to really build broad support for transmission investment in states and regions, even in parts of regions where there has historically been a resistance to building more transmission?
Absolutely. I mean, I think basically what John just said is how we do it, right? I mean, I think there has been a lack of consideration when we think about dispatchable generation or capacity in transmission. Transmission always seems to be kind of out there, or it looks like it becomes very regional based or very just kind of project based, right? If the demand is growing in a region, okay, well now we'll build a transmission line, right? Like it seems to always be the afterthought once the crisis arrives, instead of how transmission can be used to ensure a crisis never rises, right? And I think that is the proposition that needs to be presented: is what value does investment in transmission do to the grid and the system as a whole? Because, right, I mean, I think if you kind of thinking about one of those child toys, it looks like it's just the stick that you add when you need to build something else, and you put another little component there, right? But I think if we change this conversation to say, well, wait a minute, this, as we are talking about 20 years planning, as we are thinking about where the grid is, how does that cost of transmission that I may make today really benefit where I'm going and seeing in 20, 30 years down the future, right? Because I mean, I think that is where transmission typically loses out among regulators is the cost factor. And most of the time the review is the cost as it stands today for what we would get today, not necessarily what do we get over time. So I think one of the ways advocates can do is start to really make that long-term value proposition of, here are the benefits. Here is why it is important to invest now. Because yes, you may not see the direct benefits today. Yes, you may say, well, wait a minute, I could have maybe it was better if I just built a 200 megawatt or 300 megawatt gas cycle combustion turbine, and that would have solved my problems. But if I show that, like, hey, look, here's an asset. It may cost a little bit more today, but look what you're going to do when you, from the depreciation value of a generator and all the other factors that we take into consideration, right? I mean, I think that's where you put it. And so I think it's really important, especially in this moment, as we are seeing AI data centers and just the amount of demand that is coming onto our grid and what that's going to do with prices, right? Especially given what we've seen from the big beautiful bill that is changing the tax credits around renewable and batteries. I think this is the moment, because I feel we're going to be faced with a real price crunch coming up, where the demand's going to be higher. Prices are going to soar because we're not going to be able, or we won't have significant investment in other alternative generation mixes. And I think here's where transmission can say, we have been at the table, we should have been at the table, and now here we can help ensure that this real kind of price crunch that a lot of us are predicting based off of the changes that we've seen recently don't really hit consumers. And I think that's where it is. I think transmission has to make a consumer case the way that a lot of times I think generation makes a consumer case.
That's a great segue, sort of, and Andy, John, feel free to jump in, but just affordability, right? We've talked about it. It's certainly come up in sort of all of our answers. It's something that we can't ignore. It's something that we couldn't ignore before, and it's becoming even more pressing now. Just interested in some more drilling down on the trade-offs on the economic and reliability between sort of sticking with our system today. We're largely siloed in our grids, to investing in more interregional connections, and sort of more simply questions that, people are asking all over the country. Can ratepayers afford more transmission, right? These are not cheap investments. So can we really afford to build more transmission?
Yeah, I personally feel like that question needs to be flipped. It's, can they afford not to? Because to Commissioner Lewis's point, there's been a very reactive focus in many places in terms of planning. And so you end up with solutions that look low cost for the problem before us, but add up to be higher cost and less efficient in the long run. And so when we engage in proactive planning exercises, looking sufficiently far in the future, when we do that using scenario-based methodologies to look at multiple potential futures, because of course none of us have a crystal ball about exactly what that future will look like, and we engage in that appropriate benefit quantification that Andy and I were both referring to earlier, you can demonstrate that those larger investments may actually be, and often are, more beneficial to ratepayers in the long run. And one of the analogies I use is like repeating something I said earlier: least cost is not the same as most cost effective. If I need a new pair of boots, I can buy one for $20 this year, and next year I'm going to need a new pair of boots over and over and over again. Or I can spend $100 on a good pair of boots that'll last me 10 years. One was the least cost for that just in the moment decision. The other was much more cost effective in the long run when I thought about that long-term picture. And I think one of the things that we need to do is a better job of presenting that counterfactual to ratepayers and other stakeholders. We often present them with the costs of the investment we're seeking to make, but not always the costs of the alternatives, and certainly not in that proactive mindset. And so rather than just, oh, your bill would go up by, so many dollars a month on average if we make this investment, we need to say, actually, this is saving you so many dollars a month over the other thing we would have to do instead to address that immediate need, when we recognize all of the values that interregional transmission solutions and transmission solutions in general can provide. across reliability, resiliency, market efficiency, resource adequacy, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, John. We're getting close on time, and we got a bunch of questions, all really focused on the topic du jour, which is data centers and large loads and what to do about them. So, questions about stranded costs. Should utilities and states follow what Ohio and AEP are doing? Views on obligating the large load data centers to pay for the facilities that are built largely to serve them. We also had questions about demand flexibility of data centers and large loads. Should they be required to provide that flexibility? A lot of different concepts floating around there around demand from data centers and what to do about them and sort of their impact on the grid. Maybe I'll start with you, Andy. Any thoughts on what to do with all of those topics and how to think about the risks of data centers to building out the grid for them and the fear that there's going to be stranded cost if we do that?
Yeah, it's an open question. I think we need to all see like how this is going to play out, because in the last 2 years, everybody started freaking out about, boy, we're getting a lot of spot load additions. Certainly a lot of expedited project requests in MISO. What is happening here? And so y'all got to work on, looking at what some of the data center load growth looked like at Grid Strategies over the last couple of years and develop some really great reports providing a good overview of things. But as I mentioned earlier, you have a pipeline of new load prospects at some utilities that gets up to, that covers a pretty wide spread. You have something like 16 gigawatts of new load in Georgia Power's IRP that balloons to, well, we have about 50 gigawatts overall that might be connected over there. And then you just need to really make an executive decision about scenario planning with transmission planning to just see what the most certain load scenario looks like. And create the proper bookends too, looking at multiple scenarios. So I think it just remains to be seen like how real these load prospects are. Like Meta is a pretty advanced project in North Louisiana. And I have, personal feelings that, maybe I wouldn't share about like just how we need to really be proceeding on sharing costs and stuff like that. But as things wind through regulatory approvals, you can only achieve so much in the bargaining about who shares costs for what the benefits of projects are. But there really just is not enough analysis of benefits. And we have like a vast amount of benefits that MISO has developed through the stakeholder process that has even been adopted in Order 1920 in a lot of cases. And at the same time, we have, I think, over $5 billion worth of reliability transmission in Louisiana alone, Louisiana and Southeast Texas, maybe. And these are big projects. Some of them are over 50 miles. Some of them are over 150 miles. They're 500 kV. And we get a list of drivers, but we don't get a list of benefits. And sometimes when they're economically screened, we see 0.01 benefit to cost ratio, which is quite lower than what has come out of the LRTP process. So I think we just need to be more careful and more strategic about how we're planning transmission to ensure that there are less stranded costs. But that's why we do multiple scenarios. Like, we want to ensure there aren't stranded costs. I've had an advocate who's been in this space for 30 years tell me, though, that they're pretty hard pressed to find a single stranded transmission line across the country. Somebody's going to use it somehow. But I know that could be kind of controversial in the Northeast, too, because I know you guys had a project up there where that might have been a possible case. But yeah, I kind of rest my case. It's like, you don't want to gold plate the system and never strive towards that and always guard against that. But it's hard to find stranded assets with transmission.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe John, in 1 minute, can you sort of explain how we use, you mentioned scenarios and how important scenarios are, how scenarios sort of fit into this question about load growth and how to deal with it?
Yeah, I think that forward-looking scenario-based planning is exactly how we ensure that we avoid stranded assets, because it allows us to look across multiple potential futures, including different load growth scenarios, which could include different large load growth scenarios, and identify investments that are going to be very low regrets in the near term and preserve optionality for further build out in the longer term as we see which of those futures is going to come more into focus. And I agree with Andy. I cannot think of a case in which well-designed, that being the caveat, transmission is regretted. It has so many different benefits that when you are proactively planning appropriately and identifying those investments, you're going to get the value.
Commissioner Lewis, you want the last word? Any final thoughts to share?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a question that we regulators across the country are wrestling with. I'm wrestling with this question, as Andy alluded to, our pending proceeding on Meta. And I think this is where, as they come and we think about cost, what do we do, right? I mean, there's this kind of phrase that's happening that's like, well, we don't typically make customers be responsible for their own generation and transmission, but we also have never had customers be the size that these data centers are coming, right? So I think it is fundamentally toying with the status quo of regulatory affairs, which, as we all know, this is an industry that does not like change a lot. And so I think this question is something that we have to consider as we talk about reliability and we talk about affordability, right? I mean, the question is, we weren't talking about AI and data centers at this level 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so the question bodes, will we be talking about them this way 5 years from now and 10 years from now? And how do we evaluate that proposition to make the best decision? Because the last thing we know is we do not want stranded assets. And I think part of what we are seeing or potentially seeing is if most of these data centers are basically coming on with generation buildup, what does that mean for captive ratepayers who are stuck in systems if states or regulatory regimes basically make it a socialized among all customers instead of the individual customer? And so I'm wrestling with that question. I think this is an important kind of topic and questions, and we're seeing states across the nation handle it very differently. And I think there has not been a consensus of what is the step forward, but it seems that there is a consensus that the question needs to be asked.
Thanks, Commissioner Lewis, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Thank you for the interesting and insightful questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists, as well as thanking ACEG for hosting this webinar today on a topic that there is much more to be said about as we move forward. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thanks so much.